All right, now we've only really got like at the most 2 hours, probably a bit less than that, before we have to leave you. So what we want to do is try to squeeze in what we can. So the first thing we're going to try and squeeze in is a quick discussion about the conscience. This beautiful mechanism that God provided to your soul. So here's your soul. I'll say this is a heterosexual couple, shall we? So that's the soul. And obviously God, and we put God right up here. Now this doesn't mean that God's a far away, but I'll put it up there because I haven't got enough space in between. So it's really interesting that there's 2 mechanisms God provided to the human soul in which you can receive things from God. Now, one of those mechanisms God's constantly provided since the creation of humans. So it's not something that God has restricted in its operation, but something that's available to every human and has been available to every human for the entire of human's existence on this earth. And it also is available to every spirit. So it's available whether you're on earth or in the spirit world, because it's a soul-based quality. So it's something that is available no matter where you are. And that is this thing called the conscience. Now, a lot of people on earth sort of see it as an inner voice saying whether something is right or wrong. So you know how you feel like you're going to go ahead or you want to go ahead and do something, and you sort of feel or sense that, oh, maybe that thing isn't very good to do. All right? So I'm not talking something that's driven by fear. I'm not talking about something where you get afraid of it and so then you think it's a bad idea. But I'm talking about just this inner voice, sort of like a lot of people call it a gut feeling. I'm just going to stop this ringing that's occurring. A lot of people call it like a gut feeling or a sense that determines what is right and what is wrong. So you could say it is what you might classify as allowing you to have moral determination. Well, what's a better way of saying that? Morals are God's truth being shared with you about what's right and wrong, and the conscience is the operation from which allows you to receive God's ideas about what is moral. Right? Now, there is an operation in the soul. There's an actual function of your soul that God created that allows Him to share truth with you. It is, you could say, fortunately, or if you're mind dominant, you could say, unfortunately, only an operation of the soul. So it's not an operation of the mind. So as we talked about on Saturday, as we become more mind dominant, we don't realise it, but in the end we're also closing down this mechanism that allows God to share moral truth with you. So in other words, allows God to say to you, this is right and this is wrong. Now, God's always trying to share with all of her children whether the things they are doing are right or wrong. He's not going to control you after that. He's just sharing with you the truth and then leaving it up to you. Does that make sense to you? And for a lot of people, just the sharing of the truth is, they don't even want that. So what they do is they close down the mechanism by becoming more intellectually dominant, They close down the mechanism to the point where they can't hear God sharing the truth with them anymore. Right? And Mary and I have done a series of videos, I think they were, interview videos Mary and I did between ourselves. And I can't remember the year. It's some...
I think it might be in the forgiveness series.
It might be in the forgiveness and repentance series.
Yes, there's a whole section on the conscience.
There's a whole section on there on the conscience, and it explains in more details what the conscience is, how it works, and what its restrictions are, why it gets restricted in humanity, and what you can do about that. So all of that information is there on those videos. In amongst there's a whole series of about 13 videos, I think, on forgiveness and repentance that we did. And I think we did it as interviews in something like 2000 and, who knows. But I think it was sometime 17 or 18 or something like that, 16, but I can't remember. But if you look at that, it sort of describes the full functioning of the human conscience and how it fundamentally works. But what we want to talk about right now is you've got this mechanism which is inbuilt, and it's a mechanism that both halves of the soul share in its functionality. So in other words, the whole soul has the function of being able to receive communication from God through the operation of the conscience, but the two halves have a different, the way they interface to that functionality is if the half of the soul has emotional restrictions that they've got on themselves, they might not be as sensitive to it as the other half of the soul is. Does that make sense to you? Because every single emotion you store in your half of the soul, any unloving emotion, that remains stored in your half of the soul, it restricts the operation of the conscience. And the reason why that's true is because your addictions in particular play a part of restricting the emotional flow of information into your soul. And so to some degree that causes restrictions. However, the way to open it is really quite simple. You just have to have a sincere desire to know the truth, God's truth, on a subject. That's all you need. A sincere desire to know God's truth on any subject. So like, you can, and God's not picky about the subject either. So let's say it's something that you might think is mundane. Well, God will have truths that God can share about even what you believe are mundane issues. And sometimes what you believe are mundane issues are actually very significant issues from God's perspective. There's a lot of truths that God would like to share with you about them, because there are oftentimes things that we think are mundane or simple or basic that actually have very complex truths associated with them, and complex issues of love associated with them. So God's happy to share information on any subject, scientific subjects, worldly subjects, personality, personal interrelation subjects, whatever you can think of, God's very happy to share with you, because God's desire for you is to have as much information at your disposal as you can possibly have. So that's wonderful, isn't it, really? You think of a good parent would do that, wouldn't they? And have a feeling that they wanted to share with you as much information that can assist your life as they possibly could. So this operation of this conscience is very simple, and all you really need to do is exercise a sincere, and this is the tricky part, a sincere desire to know God's truth on whatever the subject is. Now, some answers are so difficult for God to share because our development precludes us from receiving an answer. So an example of that is, let's say you wanted to know what the structure of the universe was. It's a valid question, right? Humans have been trying to discover that for centuries, right? Millennia, actually. And so let's say you wanted to know. Now, God can share that with you, but you need a certain amount of development in love because the universe is structured around love. You need a certain amount of development in love to understand it. And the trouble is, to understand it more, you need more love. And when I say the trouble is, it means that the less love you actually have, the harder it's going to be to understand the answers. So God also tries to share the truth with you commensurate or in balance with how much love you have. So a simple thing like this is possible. Remember on Friday we had the question, we started with the question, does God exist or is God real? Well, we can ask God whether God exists. But I need a certain amount of openness in my soul to receive the answer, don't I? Right? Because my soul, as we pointed out Saturday, has a whole set of emotions. And in those emotions, if I've got an emotion, if I don't want there to be a God, then it's going to be very hard for God to say, yes, I exist to you, because emotionally you're going to be going, oh, but I don't want him to exist. So this is what I mean by a sincere desire. It has to be a real, pure desire to know, not one that's like, I want to ask because it will prove my idea right. You understand the difference? We're not asking so that we can prove that we're right. We're asking what is right, which is a very different thing. Many of us, when we ask questions, and you've even noticed that perhaps in this conversation we've had with you the last 3 days, many of you, when you ask questions, you're asking a question because you want to prove you're right. And that's not a question. That's not a sincere question. A sincere question is, what is right? I want to know what is right. So developing sincerity is the key to the receiving answers through the operation of the conscience. As soon as you develop a proper sincerity, you will receive instant answers on any subject, as long as you have the proper level of sincerity about that subject. All right? And it doesn't matter what subject, like I said, science or otherwise. Now, of course, if you don't have a certain level of development to understand the subject, then of course there's going to be a limited amount of information that can be shared. So let's say you're asking a question that's about, has a complex physics answer, and you've had no experience of physics your entire life, then it would make sense that there's a limited amount of information God can share with you on that subject, particularly if you're not in the development of love where you're open enough to understand complicated physics. You follow? So there are limitations on the operation of the conscience that we ourselves put on it. From God's perspective, God wants to share everything. Our capacity, just like any child who's developing, our capacity to receive the answer is going to be different depending on our development. So it's like, if you imagine like a 2-year-old asks questions about, if they can speak by now, right? And they ask a question like, where did I come from? Now, the answer you would give the 2-year-old as to where they came from would have to be a lot more simple, wouldn't it? Because of the development of their brain and their development of their ideas and their understanding of language is going to be a very different answer. You could give them the fundamental basics of an answer, like out of mum's tummy might be an answer, and you might give in that place. But, then you could say, but your soul, and if you could explain what a soul is, you might have to get it out on a picture on the diagram and you might have to say, here's your bodies and draw pictures and here's what your soul is. That soul came from God. So you could explain all that to a 2 or 3-year-old, you could, but you'd have to do it in a very, very basic manner, wouldn't you? In terms of the language they have and the development they have and their understanding. Now, when that 2-year-old is now 14 years old, can you see, you can share a lot more information about it, can't you now, with them? Because by now they've learnt about sexual organs, and they've learnt about how you can be a lot more complicated. Oh, this particular body, the physical one, came from this process. This spirit body came from this process, and still the soul came from this process. And you can share more information because the development of the child is greater, and therefore the child is able to receive that information. So you can see, as a parent, you can share information, but you have to sort of wait to a degree for the development of the child, for the child to understand the information you're sharing. And God does the same thing with you. So God can't share with you things that God knows are way beyond your capacity to understand. He can only share with you the things that you have a sincere desire to know and that are within the limits of your capacity to understand. Everyone get that? So it's important to know that's a limitation, you could say, of not the conscience mechanism, but it's a limitation of our development. And when I say development, I mean not only our development in love or truth or any of those qualities, but also our maturity, our development in terms of our lifespan and our development in terms of our experience. All of those things are a part of our development. So this soul, and you can see if we're talking about the two halves, the development of each half may be different, mightn't it, at any one point in time? So let's say the male here, he has grown up in an environment where mummy nursed him until he was 20, and she's still cooking for him at 20 and still cleaning up after him at 20, and he basically is still reliant on mummy. You know, he lives at home still and he hasn't matured very well. And then on the female side, she might have left home when she was 16. She's looking after herself, cleaning up after herself, you know, preparing her own meals and washing up after herself. Now, obviously, she's more developed than he is. Can you see? In terms of self-responsibility, self-love. And so she will be more open to receiving the truth from God than he will be, particularly about issues of self-love. Right? So it's going to be dependent upon the individual development and the individual's growth development as to how much information can be received. But bearing that in mind as a just something to keep in mind, you still have the operation of the conscience and you can ask any question you like. Now, what I personally like doing is asking yes or no questions. And the reason why I like doing that is because where possible, if I can ask a yes or no question, God can make the answer very, very clear, yes or no. But when you ask more complicated questions, then obviously packets of information have to be received, and that is going to be very dependent, isn't it, on your openness to receiving that information. But when it comes to yes or no questions, you can ask, like, this is what I did in the first century. You know, I've been thinking about God for a while. I was still a child, a small child really, and I was thinking about, you know, that everybody says, you know, I grew up in an environment where everybody says there was a God, you know, and also everyone said God was pretty angry and God was, you know, like a bit of a monster really, is the environment I grew up in the first century about God, and I wanted to know things about God. So, and the very first thing I wanted to know was, does God exist? So I asked God and received feelings which then formed thoughts. So the way it worked was I received feelings and then they formed thoughts. And I could tell, even at the young age, that they weren't from me because I didn't know. So they weren't from me. So they came from some source outside of me. At this stage, I didn't even know whether that source was God, but I worked out even how to determine that through this mechanism of the conscience. And in asking the question, I got a very affirming yes, God exists. And I thought about that a while, you know, like, if God exists, then that opens up a whole heap of other questions, doesn't it? Like, if God exists, then what's God like? You know, is God nice or nasty or, you know, abusive or punishing? You know, my father in the first century, he was at times pretty abusive of me. And it was quite difficult at times living in our family because of it. And so I wanted to know what God was like. Was he like that? Or my mother was a bit more nurturing, a bit more caring, but my mother had a lot of fears. My mother Mary had a lot of fears. So, you know, I needed to know things like even, well, does God have fear? So I didn't know whether God would have fear or not. So I asked, you know, and the more questions I asked, particularly the yes or no questions, the answers came pretty fast. And so it enabled me to have a sincere interaction. And then I started realising, everything I ask, there is a potential answer, and it's going to just depend upon a number of things about me and what I ask and how much developed I am to ask. So this really encouraged me to be really open-minded and open-hearted about what I ask as well. And that helped me a lot. I asked questions that eventually, like I was asking questions when I was 6 or 7, and we used to go to synagogue, and, you know, obviously there would be a priest in the synagogue who would administer, you know, the instructions of the day. And quite often I got to the stage now where I was asking questions that they haven't even asked because they felt there was no answer. See, part of the problem humanity has is we feel God's not going to share the truth, and so therefore we don't even think to ask. So that was an issue too. So once that happened, then I could start realising, well, there's so many things I could ask, man. You know, it's like, if you make a list of all the things you'd really like to know about, and you're really sincere about it, I think you'll find that there's like literally hundreds of thousands of things probably you'd like to ask. And quite often you go down chains of thoughts by asking these things that bring up new questions, and you have to ask about that as well. So what I would like to encourage you to do is to start this process of developing a sincere desire to know the answer to issues and problems in your life. This is a way that you can begin developing a relationship with God, even if you haven't received love yet. Right? You can begin developing a relationship with God by asking these important questions and being sensitive enough to feel the responses. And then the key is to eventually become sensitive enough to know whether these responses are from within you or from outside of you. See, it's interesting with the conscience because many times you would like the answer to be what your addictions want, and yet you get an opposite answer. Right? And this is why people historically, many people have been fascinated by the conscience for this reason, because often the person's conscience tells them things they don't want to hear. And that's why humans in the past have tried to investigate the operation of the conscience, because oftentimes they wanted to hear something, they heard the opposite thing, so they wanted to hear it something affirming, you know, so like let's say I'm with Mary, but I want to have an affair, and they want to hear, yeah, go ahead with the affair, you know, because the addiction says go ahead with the affair, so I want to hear that. But then what their conscience is saying, don't do it. Right? And so this has been very confusing for religious and even for people in, you know, who are very interested in, you know, philosophies such as, you know, evolutionary philosophies, because like, how is it that you hear something that's the opposite of what you want? You know, it's a very confusing thing when people first consider it. But there is this conscience that God is sharing things with all of you, and so there are many times you're going to hear exactly the opposite of what you want to hear. And your sincerity will determine whether you actually do anything about that or not. And what I find is the more you hear that's the opposite of what you want to hear, the more you try to turn off the conscience. Right? Because once you hear something, you've then got another problem, and that is it bothers you if it's the opposite of what you want to hear. And it's a really tricky thing getting bothered all the time. I don't know if any of you have noticed that, when you do something that your conscience is saying is wrong, and then next day you worry about it, and quite often you have bad dreams about it, and you get sleepless nights about it, and this is your conscience bothering you. And the reason why it bothers you is now that you've heard it, it's so hard to unhear it, isn't it? Right? So this is the beauty of the conscience, so is you can hear the information, and then God just leaves it up to you as to what you're going to do about it. Right? So when I first asked God, does God exist? God didn't go, yes, I exist, and you can have a relationship with me, and you can, that's not what I heard. What I heard was, yes, I exist. And then I had to ponder about, okay, if God exists, then what if I can have a relationship with God? That would be good. If God exists and God could tell me things, that would be good. So I started asking questions. Do you want to tell me things? Yes. Okay. What do I need to do now? Is work out what things I want to hear about. What do I want to, what truths do I want to hear? So that caused me to go, okay, what about, is God going to share things? Can God share things with me? Like, yes. Okay. Can you see it's like the more yes or no questions I asked, it led to more yes or no questions. and then in the process of doing that, it was like yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, led me down a labyrinth, if you like, of to the point where I got to the point of saying, is there something unique in you that I can receive that no one's ever received? And the answer to that question was yes. So this got me wondering, what is that thing? What is that thing that I could receive that no one's ever received on earth, like on this earth? And I was, that was like months of just thinking about it and, what is it? What would it be? And then I started looking at happiness on earth, and I started questioning when people are happy and when they're unhappy, and I started realising that love seemed to be the thing that made people happy. And then I was thinking about, but nobody seems to be happy with God. They're all terrified of God, and they're all, if not upset with God, they're in a conflict with God a lot. And then I started wondering whether it's love from God that is the thing. So I ask. And that's the first time I received God's love. And, a big feeling for me, receiving it right in that moment. That was the first time that I had a conscious awareness. And now I later learned from God that I'd already received some, and I didn't really know. But that was the first time that I received some and I knew what it was that I was receiving. And that just had a huge effect on me. It still does when I think about it now, Had a huge effect on me because it caused me to realise, there's this... And with the love came other feelings too, like approval sort of feelings. Like, this is the direction you need to take type of feelings. And this helped me even determine what my desire in life was and everything. And I didn't know at the time that I would be the very first person that I was now. I knew I was the very first person to receive it, but I didn't know the significance of that either at that time. I was just happy that I'd received it. So, and what that did is it allowed me then to go, can I receive more? Yes, and how does the mechanism of it all work? Now I'm starting to ask non-yes or no questions, and also actually receiving now packets of information. This is how it works. And then what I had to do is put my feelings of how it works into words, and that's how I termed the term Holy Spirit, the mechanism, the conduit, that via which we receive love. And then I started to realise that that conduit only became open when I was in a state of truth, a sincere desire for it. And this is how, so now I was not only learning for myself how it all worked, but now I was also trying to work out, well, how can I share this with others? Because it's wonderful, right? So then I had to come up with terminology, which is still used in the celestial heavens today, the same terminology. I'm not always, it's not as descriptive perhaps as I'd like, but language is difficult. You know, when you have emotions, turning emotion into language is quite hard, right? So it took a while for me to come up with terms that people could understand and we could teach. But that's the process I went through. It started with the conscience. You follow? And eventually coming to trust that God wanted to share every truth with me. Yeah? So what I would recommend you start doing is that with your life. Start with some simple questions if you want. If you can't receive the answers, you can even ask, why can't I receive the answer? But that's a more complicated question, isn't it? And therefore going to require a more complicated answer. And if we're not open to that, then it's going to be hard to receive those answers. But the key, I found, for me, the key was to yes or no right at the beginning, because that's real simple. And you can feel the answers, emotionally feel the answers as you proceed. But you're going to have to open up your emotional senses. And this is why we had the discussion with you yesterday about the mind. Because for many of you, your emotional senses have been so shut down from the mind, right? And that's why we need to address those issues about the mind and its dominance of your soul. Okay? So the real thing then becomes, well, how just do you do this in practice? Like if you think about it, it's pretty easy. What's the question you want to know? You tell me a question you'd like to know. You see, I'm doing this with you every time you ask a question. I'm not going, what's the answer to that question? I'm going, what's the answer to that question? And then God shares a whole heap of information with me and I just share it with you. That's why everything I say to you is off the top of my head, as people would probably be aware, right? It's not like I've thought about it for centuries beforehand or hours before, and I'm thinking, what is it Evo would like to know about? I try to work out that and then come up with what Evo wants to know about. When Evo asks a question, I ask God, well, what's the answer? And there's the answer, so I tell Evo. Does that make sense? It's like, and then I also know the answer for myself too, because sometimes I haven't even thought about what you're asking. Sometimes I've given it no thought at all. And so you ask a question, I'm going, well, yeah, never thought about that, but here's the answer. Do you know what I mean? And this is what you're able to do when you're connected to God. Like, God wants to share truth with you. And I know there are some things you want to know that I haven't asked about. You know? But the beauty of being connected to God is if you ask it, I can answer it. That's good. And you can too. That's good too. So what do you want to know about right now? Anything come up? Let's go.
Yeah.
Yep.
You always talk about humans on different planets and stuff. I almost always say this planet. So I was curious, are there more planets? Are there more human civilizations out there?
I
Just
didn't
a
get
quick
a lot of
question.
that.
Is there other human civilizations on other planets?
Yeah. Is there other civilizations on other planets? Is that the question? Okay. So now we're going to have to be sincere. Do you really want to know that? How many of you are totally bored with that subject? Be honest. Yeah, you're not going to get an answer, right? Simple as that.
But those people who are interested.
Who are you interested in that subject? Right, really interested. You've got to be really interested. Okay, so you're really interested in that subject. Okay, so if you're totally bored with the subject, it's pointless even trying, right? If you're really interested in that subject, how do you develop a sincere desire to know the answer? Like, can you see you have to formulate the question for yourself, emotionally formulate the question, feel, okay, why do you want to know? So can you answer that question, why you want to know?
I guess I'm looking for like stuff like purpose. What is the reason?
Okay, so really it's a poor motive. Can you see why? It's a poor motive because I'm not sincerely wanting to know. I want to know for my own sake, which is a selfish desire to know. So you're hoping that the answer will provide you some significant motivation for your life in terms of your life's purpose. And that's not going to be the result of this answer. Does that make sense to you? Yeah. So this is where we have to be sincere, right? We have to really find out, why is it I want to know that? Now, the reality is, maybe I shouldn't tell you the reality. You should ask God what the reality is first, probably. And then we'll talk about it a bit more about that one subject. But let's first just go through the process of asking, right? So who of you felt you were sincere and you really want to know? Can you see now it's like 5 of us who really want to know? And you can see why, can't you? Because a lot of times it's because we have these ulterior motives in our questions. And so what I did, if I noticed any ulterior motive, and particularly this is what I do now that I still carry some sin, which I didn't do in the first century, but what I wanted to know, I've got to be really honest about whether I'm really sincere about knowing or not. And the very first thing is I try to, am I sincere? Yes or no? You can be sincere about asking whether you're sincere. Does that make sense? And God can even tell you whether you're being sincere in the moment. Right? So so the very first thing I would do if I felt, I'm a bit suspicious, whether I'm sincere or not, I would ask God whether I am sincere, and God would say, when you receive a yes from God, it's usually a confirming emotional response. When you receive no, it's like nothing. Just nothing. No, like you don't get anything. Because if God gave you a response, then you'd think yes. So there's nothing that comes from God. So when there's nothing coming from God, I know the answer's no. Does that make sense to you? If nothing's coming from God, I know there's 1 or 2 reasons why. One reason why is because of my development, or the other one is no. And I just mostly assume no and go from there. Let me continue. So let's ask the question. Those of you who ended up being sincere, have we analysed that? Yep, sincere about it. And you really want to know just for the sake of knowing. Yeah? That's what it's about, knowing for the sake of knowing. Not knowing for selfish reasons, but knowing for the sake of knowing. Now, once you know, it may change your future decisions. Of course. But to be sincere, you have to just want to know for the sake of knowing. Yeah? Know the truth because you want the truth. That's it. So what's the answer? What's God's answer? God will give the answer straight away. What do you feel, those of you who want to know, what do you feel is the answer to that question? Is there human life on other planets? What's the answer? So of those of you who wanted to know, how many of you think yes? And how many of you think no? Okay. So you got your answer. And people see, when you say that, people say, but that's surely not how it works. It's too simple. It doesn't make any sense. And what if you really wanted to think that there was when, well, you'll get no answer. It's the answer to that question. So you can find out. Now, how has that affected your life, that question? Can you see it's hardly affected your life at all? Isn't that true? It's like, okay, now I know that. Well, what do I do with knowing that, right? And so, to my mind, there are some questions that are like, well, once you know that, so what? And then there's other questions that is a very significant thing to know for my life right now. Very significant to know right now these particular things. So put some priority system into it and some thought into it. God likes you being, passionate about a thing, but also think about things a bit logically as well. This is where you can use your mind and you can say, well, once I know that, how does that affect me? Well, if you were a scientist, you may want to find out how to discover and prove there is human life on other planets. You may even want to know where they are in the universe, in the so-called universe that we on this earth think we know about so far. You might want to know that, so that you can direct your telescope in that direction. Your radio telescope that can hear and receive beams of radio information. You might want to put that out there. So you might be a scientist and you're really passionate about the idea, and you go, well, there's this whole 360 degrees in a 3D version of a thing that I can point my telescope. Where do I point it? And if you want to know, then God can tell you, point it in this direction. Of course, it may not help you, because on this earth, one other question I asked God when I asked God that question was, are we in an advanced enough state of civilization to communicate with those other earths? That's one of the questions I asked. And the answer to that was no. So if I wanted to build a telescope, I wouldn't bother doing it for that purpose, because we're not in an advanced enough state as a civilization to properly receive and properly process and deal with the answer to that question. So God's told me that. Now, we might be in the future, I don't know. I don't know when that will be. It might be in 20 years' time. If everybody received God's love to the point of at-one-ment, there'd be no danger to you as a society then, would there? There'd be no dangers to the other society when you started trying to communicate with them. Right? So God's considering these things, of course, and God doesn't want this society to influence the other society in a negative manner when they already have their own problems. So one of the questions I did ask is, what are the problems of those societies? The answer to that's pretty clear too. Same as yours. Same as this society. And that, if you think about it, makes a lot of sense. But you can see that if these two societies that have got current fundamental problems got together, you can see the problems might even be worse as a result of that. And of course, God's not going to encourage that process. Even if humans decide to do it, God's not going to encourage it, because it's out of harmony with love. But the beauty of doing this is that you can also ask things like, and see, I have one advantage in that I've met some from those other earths. Yeah, in our union state, there's actually other people like myself in those places who also entered the union state, and we've managed to talk. Fascinating talk, because we've got very similar emotions. Being one of the first persons to discover love on a planet, God's love, you go through very similar emotions, right? So that's the feeling we have for them, is like they're our brothers, because they've gone through almost the same things. But if you didn't know all that, and I didn't, there was a time when I didn't, we can just ask. Yep. Of course, a lot of times the significance of the answer is lost on us. Yeah, which is true too.
Jesus, can I just ask you, draw something out here? Because you said you ask questions, and if you get nothing, you think it's a no.
Yeah, I assume it's no.
Yeah. So my experience with my conscience at this point in my development is far more, I suppose, I want to utilise the conscience to help me to learn truth about my own condition. So the way I kind of experience the conscience often is a very strong, almost like sinning, not sinning. Does that make sense? Can you sort of speak about that? You're sort of talking about factual truth, but for me it's a very like am I on the right track here, God, or am I actually in a state of sin in this relationship or in this situation? And in those cases, I get a very strong, I guess, pull, like sin. Yeah.
So the reality is, if I receive nothing, then I know that I need to be more definite about my questions. It's probably the best way to say it. If there are times when you're going to receive a definite no and you'll know it's a no, right? And there are times when you'll receive a definite yes and you'll know it's a yes. And there's many times that I've seen spirits, I've encouraged spirits to go through the same experience and they receive a definite no or yes. And then because many of them are open emotionally, they also receive a package of why it's no or why it's yes, right? But that requires more emotional openness. And at the moment, as a group of people here, you're quite shut down to your feelings and emotions. So, very mind dominant. And so initially you're going to have to just experiment with this process and you're going to get quite frustrated at times about it, but you're going to have to experiment with it. And you're going to have to get to the stage where you start trusting your soul faculties rather than your mind. Because your mind's going to be screaming at you, why are you doing this stupid thing? Does that make sense to you? You're going to be thinking, why am I even trying this crazy thing to do? It's like, doesn't make any sense to me. Doesn't make sense why it's going to work, because we've shut down emotionally. See, in the first century, for me, I wasn't shut down emotionally when I started trying it, so it was easy to engage it. But the more shut down you are emotionally, in this life, I was so shut down emotionally, as I said, when I was 33, I couldn't do this at all. I had to first open up emotionally before I could even begin to do it. One of the first things I opened up about emotionally in this life was, is God unhappy with me? That was a big... when I was in my early 30s, I was in a religious faith that I left, and that religious faith said I was condemned to eternal destruction by leaving. And I was indoctrinated in that faith. So I even began to think that I was condemned to eternal destruction by leaving, right? And it took me a few months to work through emotionally the feeling that I was condemned, and nobody, my family didn't want to talk to me, as I said, my friends, nobody wanted to talk to me. It took me quite a few months to just work through that emotionally. So I had some big cries about, nobody wanting to know me anymore, nobody wanted to talk to me anymore, being alone. People walk down the street and they would stare hatred at you almost, and it was pretty harsh. And it felt pretty bad. I had to work my way through those emotions. But then after a while, I got to the point where I was brave enough to just ask God, have you condemned me eternally? Yeah. And the answer to that question was no. That God hadn't condemned me eternally, yeah? And then once I started going like that, I go, so I started asking questions again about why, because, and I got the fundamental beliefs that I had were actually all false. The fundamental religious beliefs I had at that stage of my life were all completely false. And God told me that, pretty plainly, actually. Yeah. You want to ask? Mike, thank you.
Let's say I ask something and I get nothing.
Yep.
Presumably that could also mean, or be telling me that I'm not sincere.
Correct. Obviously, for this to work, for yes, no, or even just sometimes you receive an answer, but it's sort of like you need to ask more questions, answer. You need to be more specific about what you want to know, answer. So you get quite, after a while, there's nuances of it after a while that you become very sensitive to about yes, but, or no, but there's this thing to, you get even that, going on eventually. At the beginning, that doesn't happen because it's not emotionally sensitive enough. But you're right in the sense that if there is no sincere desire, there is no response. Yeah.
And,
And that's the same with receiving God's love. If there's no sincere desire, there is no response. Yep.
yeah, because I would say that in this life, I felt almost entirely disconnected from the conscience. And I think I shared about that in those videos. And now that I feel sensitive to the conscience, I never get nothing. I always get a response, whether it's the yes, no kind of more information.
More information required.
You're missing the mark on
the question.
On the question, yeah.
Yep.
And if I don't get anything, then I know I'm not really,
Yep.
I don't actually want to know the answer.
I think this is kind of obvious, but like the answer, I'm going to have to feel it. I'm not going to hear.
That's right.
Yeah, what happens is there'll be feelings passed to you from God, and then that will trigger thoughts. And so you're going to have to be able to feel before you think about it.
Okay.
And also, the more loving you become, the easier it is to do that. Because obviously these mechanisms all work better with love than they do with not, because everything in the universe is designed around the functioning of love. So obviously the more, loving the intention on your part, the more sensitive you'll become. Yep. Next to you. Yeah, Ziggy, is it? Yeah.
And how do you know you're not getting tricked by your mind or a spirit?
Good question. Yeah, good question. There are questions you can ask, aren't they, as well?
Yeah.
About. But also what I had to do
Even
was
in the-
question, was I receiving responses from spirits versus was it God or was it from spirits? Now, spirits can't work with the conscience, but they can give you inclinations through other mechanisms. There's an area in your spirit and physical body around the base of the hypothalamus in the top and the base of your brain, where they can provide or give you information through these operations, and you've got to be able to determine the difference. So that is one thing I had to sort out, and it is one thing you're going to have to sort out. Yep. But remember this, every response God gives will always be in harmony with love. Every response that comes from spirits, there'll be two types of responses, unloving ones as well as loving ones. Now, if it's loving ones, then you don't have to care where it comes from, do you really? But if it's unloving ones, then you really got to know, don't you? Because if it's unloving ones and they're influencing you in an unloving direction, it's just going to influence you further away from God, further away from yourself. So you really need to know. And so once you receive some of God's love, of course, it's easy to feel that's unloving, that's not. So in other words, let's say, should I kill myself? Is a question, right? I could ask, isn't it? Should I kill myself? Now, it's quite obvious if you receive a yes from somebody,
Yeah, that's not God.
it's an unloving person, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like if I went up to Mary and said, should I kill myself? And she goes, yeah, go for it. I can pretty much assume, isn't it, that she's got some pretty bad motives in my life, can't I? Yep. So obviously one way to measure whether you're receiving information from a good source. Now, you might not know whether it's God or good spirits at this stage, but one way you would know is whether the answer was in harmony with love. Now, with more complex questions, that can be sometimes a bit difficult to tell. But obviously, with many questions, it's very simple. That this is harmonious with love, that isn't. Yeah. So here's a good one, like that you'd have to ask more questions about. Should I leave my wife? Yeah. It's an interesting question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. The very first thing when I asked that question, should a man leave his wife, was God said to me, through the conscience said to me, define wife.
Exactly.
Define wife. What does wife mean, Because to God it's sort of like, what does wife mean? It means, see, in the first century, wife meant you owned her. She was your animal, really, that you could boss around, is how men treated women in the first century. you know, they had a terrible attitude for the most part towards women. And so the whole concept of wife, so what I received from God very quickly was the whole concept of wife is a flawed concept based upon human addiction. You know, and once I realised that, I also realised, well, like this whole idea, wife, husband, ownership, you know, promising self for the rest of your existence to one person, not growing, staying in a terrible relationship and abuse. It introduced all these other questions for me in the first century, it did. And then I started, we talked a lot in the first century, Mary and I, when we were travelling around. Well, after I met Mary, we talked a lot to women in particular about, and men, about how they treated each other, and particularly how men treated women as a result of all the information I got from God about the subject, which was a lot. You know, God is very, very definite about how certain things should be in a relationship between a man and a woman. And I started realising, yeah, what we had on earth was far removed, and still is, by the way, far removed from what God's intention was with regard to women and men having relationships with each other. Yeah, human relationships. So, you know, this is the beauty of asking, is you get all this information, and it's personal, but it's also like applies to everyone as well, because it's truth. Truth applies to everybody, not just to me. Yeah.
I think the biggest challenge is differentiating the conscience, the true conscience, from the familial beliefs you grew up in. Because most of the time, most of us feel something is wrong if our family had defined it as wrong, you know, and often our family wasn't correct in that. So I think it requires a bit of self-reflection about your family of origin as well.
Yeah.
To begin that process. Becoming sensitive emotionally to that family helps to differentiate, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you grow up in a family, really mum and dad are your gods for a while. That's how it sort of turns, unless they've educated you that there is a God above them and that they are subjects of God, if you like, you know, creations of God, then you will grow up believing that your mum and dad are really the arbiter, the controller of your life. And for a certain period of time, you will believe that, probably up until your teenage years for many. And then after that, they start challenging that as a concept. But, you know, while you believe that, and you're going to take on a lot of beliefs of your family, and you've got to stop treating your family's ideas and concepts as if they're right, because frequently they're not. So, and I had to do that in the first century as well. I realised at quite a young age for me that my family was way out of line when it comes to God's ideas of what a family should be. Yeah. Else?
What if you receive a loving answer and it's not God, it's a loving spirit?
Well, it's still okay to follow, isn't it? Yeah, because it's loving.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you don't know either way whether it's God or a spirit, if you can measure that it's in harmony with love, in harmony with truth, in harmony with you being humble, then it's most likely going to be correct, and maybe you just need to ask more questions, yeah, before you make a decision about it. But at least you would be on the right track.
Yeah.
See, if it's blatantly unloving, then you know you're instantly on the wrong track. And this is where people who are quite psychotic are in a place that's not good, because what happens is that psychosis, a lot of it is caused by spirit influence. And so what happens is these spirits are telling the people, do this, do that, you know, what's called schizophrenia and other things like that. Do this, do that. And a lot of things of what the spirits tell them to do is really bad for themselves or bad for others, right? And it's really obvious, but a lot of the spirits claim they're God telling them to do it. You see? And if the person on earth sort of believes, I've got a special relationship with God and God's telling me to kill you, that's pretty bad, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and it's pretty obvious that because it's impinging another person's free will, in other words, restricting another person's free will, they're not making a choice. If restricting another person's free will, I'm obviously by restricting your will, I'm out of harmony with God's love. So it's quite obvious that it's not loving, but unfortunately to the people who have this kind of psychosis, it's not obvious, but it should be obvious to everybody else, you know. And that's why most people who claim to be Jesus are in mental asylums, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because you can see they are choosing to do unloving things to lots of people, including themselves frequently, and that's why they're there. And that's why I'm not there. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
You know, I've been assessed by doctors actually. I was forced into an assessment at one point by my mother, you know, to have an assessment by a psychologist and a doctor, and they found me far too logical to be crazy and therefore put in an institution. But you can see why people are, yeah, because they're often being told to do unloving things and they go ahead and do them.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, you've got to remember, obviously, if it's God, it's going to have love in it. You know, if that's one of God's primary qualities, then it has to have love in it. And that's the way I've measured pretty much everything I've heard from God, just by measuring the love in it, the truth in it. Whether it was forcing me into a state of more humility, I always thought that was a good indication that it was also loving. And so that helped me a lot to trust it. And once you start trusting it right firmly, it's like there's so much scope. You know what I mean? If we go up the back to...
It's something I've tried a lot, asking questions, and I would at times receive answer, but some of these answers might mislead me as well. In nature, they were reasonable answer, but how can I know where they come from, and how can I know that they are the... For example, if I ask a question about emotional processing, I never really get the answer. Yeah, emotional processing is definitely going to help you.
Yeah.
The same, the teaching you follow from AJ in Australia is valid.
Yeah.
Actually, some medium would not channel some okay spirit that can help people. They don't really agree specifically with emotional feeling.
Correct.
So sometimes I never really got a definite answer. Is it the right way I'm doing by following this emotional path?
Can I suggest why? Because you don't want to do emotional processing.
Yeah.
You want it to be easier than that. And this is a problem many of you face, is that when it comes to your emotions, you would rather there be a simpler explanation. You would rather skip over the hard yards, is what most people want. See, this is a trouble we have with a lot of people. They hear divine truth, they're attracted to the sort of truth of it, except for the emotional work. Do you know what I mean? It's like everything else sounds reasonable, logical, but this emotional work, masochistic and sadistic really, is the general feeling that most of society even has. And so what we end up doing is we hear we need to do the work, but we don't want to hear it, so we go, there must be another explanation. So we go seeking for more explanations, which is what actually you've done. You've gone, you know, let's go to a medium and see what they say. Let's find another spirit, see what they say. Oh, there's a whole bunch of spirits who say you don't need to do it. So should I follow them? And, you know, and there are a whole bunch of spirits in the spirit world who are terrified of doing it. There are. And they will come to you and you don't have to do it because they want to feel they don't have to do it either. And so they'll tell you these things. And obviously none of this is coming from God. If what I'm sharing with you is from God, then obviously it's contrary. And if it was from God, it wouldn't be contrary. So God has fixed laws, fixed principles. God is consistent. So anything contrary, there must be one thing wrong with one or the other or both, right? And that's something you have to determine. But this is where sincerity comes down. We have to see our motive for the way or what we're asking. And for many of you currently, or up until now, your motive has to be to skip over the things that are hard. It's a very common human motive. And the reality on earth is that most of us want to do it. And the more comfortable a life we've had on earth, the more we want to do it. Right? And the more, by the way, you've been mummied by your mother, the more you want to do it. The more you want there to be an easy answer, right? If you think about it, in a logical sense though, if I'm carrying around, and this is something I worked out too, is that God's answers are in harmony with logic. If I am carrying around in myself somewhere, I don't know whether I've got a soul or not at this stage, but let's say in myself I can feel I've got anger, I've got resistance, I've got, sadness, I've got these different emotions. And if I'm carrying them around within myself, can you see what's going to let them leave? What's going to get them to leave me? And that's a very fundamental question I need to ask, because if I don't ask that question, I'll go, oh, let's try this method and let's try that method. And to be honest, we get thousands of emails a year on all the methods I should be using to deal with my emotions. Fair income. Like, people tell me, you're crazy doing what you're doing. You don't have to do that. You need to do this thing. This thing works. And then they say this thing works and this thing works and this thing works and this thing. Some of them I actually did try, and none of them worked. But and also none of them are permanent. Like, you would become reliant on people and all sorts of things. So after a while I realised I've just got to stop listening to all this and just listen to God. What does God want me to do? And once I just did that, it's like, this is what he wants to do. This is the thing that's going to work. And then I've done it sincerely with desire, and it works. So I am a significantly different person than I was when I started this process, because it works, not for any other reason. And the more I got told from God, this is my way, and God has told me this is his way. This is the way to clear sin, right? Once I know that, and I was told that in the first century, but I didn't have any sin to clear, so it wasn't very significant to me. In this century, I've had a lot of sin to clear, so it's been really significant to me to understand it and know that. And once I've known that and can feel that and tried it and it works, I realise, yeah, it works every time I'm sincere. It works every time. Now, there are a whole bunch of six-sphere spirits who are very well developed who don't agree. I've had communication with them for nearly 2,000 years about their disagreement. And they are sharing with people on earth that you don't need to do it. They are. And they're not in a bad condition in the sense that they're in the sixth sphere. They're in the condition of perfect natural love, so not in a bad condition. But none of them are one with God. Not a single one. Every person who's ever become at one with God has to do what I'm telling you to do. Right? Now, you might not trust that at this point, and that's fine. I've got no problem with that.
I do. Some I've heard also that your way one time was the fast way, I guess. So yeah, it makes sense actually. So.
Sorry, I missed that. What did you say?
One time I think I've heard that your way was the fast way.
The fast way.
Yeah.
But a few weeks later, maybe another advice was more general advice and was not saying to me, yeah, do this. So.
That's right. Because, you've got to remember that most people who are spirits who might come and share information with you, a lot of them have their own agendas. And I don't have an agenda with you. I'm just telling you, this is what God has got me to do. I've had to do it. You're going to have to do it. Everybody I know had to do it in order to reach the celestial kingdom. Everybody I know had to do it. So there is no other way. In fact, in the first century, I said the way the entering into the gate of heaven, the celestial heavens, was narrow. It's a narrow way leading to life, but narrow way. God defines this is the way. Just this little way you go, that has to be the way. And I also said in the first century that there's this broad way which leads to everything else. In the Bible, they now change that interpretation, say the broad way leads to destruction, which is not what I said. But it is this broad way, this broad road, which the average person on earth will take. because it's the way of compensation. It works until the sixth sphere, and lots of people take that. And so I'm not saying don't do that. I'm just saying, why do that? When you can have a relationship with God and progress infinitely, why would you choose to not have a relationship with God and be stagnant in the sixth sphere eventually? Now, many of you at the moment don't understand the significance of what it means to be stagnant in the sixth sphere because you've never visited the celestial heavens, right? And so you don't understand the significance of the difference. But trust me, it's so wide as to be almost two completely different places, where one is full of bliss and the other one is very limited. And so, but again, it's something you can experiment with and try. So the problem for many, though, is when it comes to asking questions about your emotional work, most of the time we're asking them because we don't want to do it. And it is hard. So I'm not suggesting emotional work is easy. It is hard. It does require diligence, and it does require trust in God, in God's way. It does require that, which I think is actually good. but some people don't, obviously. But if you can just bear in mind that if you get a wide variety of answers, which is really the principle of your question, if you get a wide variety of answers, then obviously more investigation is required. More investigation as to the source of those answers, where they come from, and also more investigation is required into what is your motive for asking the question in the first place. Because remember, every time you have a sincere desire and the question is directed at God specifically, God will respond with a clear answer. So if I get a wide variety of answers and they're all different, then it either means my desire was not sincere for whatever reason, and in the case of emotions, it's probably because I don't want to feel them, or I have not yet got enough desire to know what the answer will be. Because the thing with answers is this. Answers lead to other questions, but also answers lead to decisions, don't they? And many of us don't want to make decisions. Many of us want to keep our life as it is. Many of us don't want to make major changes. We don't want to know the truth necessarily. We think we do, but we're unwilling to make a choice once we know it. Right? And which would also indicate a lack of sincerity before we asked. So for example, if I ask a question of God and God gives me the answer, and let's say I am actually sincere and God gives me the answer, the sincerity, my true sincerity, the depth of it, is going to be proven by my action I take afterwards, isn't it?
Yeah.
If my action says, right, I'm going to trust that and just see where that takes me, versus my action says, but I don't want to do it, then obviously the I don't want to do it meant that maybe my question wasn't as sincere as I thought. And what was my motive for knowing, or my motive for trying to get the answer? My motive was to get my answer. So it's funny, I don't know if you've watched a lot of our videos, but you'll see some people ask the same questions over and over and over again. You know, there's one person in particular I can think of, but there's many that have done this. And every new seminar, I do a new seminar, and they put up their hand and I ask them, and they ask the same question they asked last time. Why does a person do that when I've already given them an answer? It's because they don't want that answer. They want another answer. Surely there's another answer. You know what I mean? And when it comes to emotions, because pain is associated with emotion, and a lot of our emotions are painful when we're in a state of sin, we want other answers. We want someone to say, it's not that bad, it's not going to be hard, it's not going to be difficult, it should be easy, and all this kind of stuff. And I sort of now feel like, why should it be easy? Like, for many of us on earth, our life's an absolute, total, horrifying mess. why do you think it's going to be easy tidying it up? You know, it's like you go into a house, let's say you go into a house and whoever lived there before was tidy as. You can walk in that house and you can sleep on the bed and with confidence, can't you? You can sleep on the bed and you can, go to the shower and you're not going to be covered in worms and, cockroaches and everything while you're having a shower or anything. You turn on the water, it's nice clean water coming out, and it's hot and cold and beautiful, right? If a person's looked after the place, it's great. But with our life, the majority of us haven't even known how to look after our life. And so our life's a bit of a mess. And so it's like walking into a dirty house where you can't really sleep anywhere and you're going to have to tidy things up in your life. Now, do you think that if you had your life untidy for 20 years or 30 years or 50 years, that it's going to be easy? Nobody would think, oh, I bought this rundown ruin of a house and tomorrow I'll just go pump and it's a brand new spanking, like high, 3-story mansion. Nobody's going to think that way. And yet this is the way we think with our soul. We think we can go through all these negative processes, right, in our course of our life and engage a lot of sin. And a lot of it is mistaken, I know, but we still engaged it, and we were taught to engage it and everything. And we think that after all that mess has happened, that it's going to require just a little tiny 1 month or a few days of sitting down with somebody, some counsellor or some person who waves his hand over my head or over my chest or, some kind of Reiki or whatever, and it's going to instantly cure me from that entire career of sin. Or that you have some Messiah come along and he'll take on all your sin for you. Well, that's the Christian belief, isn't it? Some Messiah will come along and he'll take away all your sin, and then, his blood pays for all your sin. And but most of us don't realise it, but we have an extension of that concept because we want simple solutions. But we've got very complicated sins. We've made them complicated through our life. They're going to take some sincerity, desire, and time, particularly time, to cure. Yeah. And you need to bear that in mind. So these people who suggest to you that there's a simple answer to some of your problems, well, some of them might be quite simple if they're minor problems, but if they're major problems, there's going to be some pretty hard emotions to feel. And I'm not glossing over that with you. You know what I mean? I'm not saying, oh, no, there's these other ways that are a lot easier. I know there isn't. Yeah. I know there's no other way. So that's what I'd encourage you to consider. From a logical perspective, who's being more honest with you? Somebody who says all of your problems that you've had all your life are going to disappear in an instant, or you don't even have to worry about them. Or someone who's saying, no, you're going to have to worry about them and you're going to have to deal with them. Who's probably more honest with you?
It seems that many of these mediums, they just do the job until you start feeling. They say that the job is done. Basically, and when you start feeling, you're not supposed to stay in the feeling.
Correct.
This is often what we hear. As soon as you have the intellectual connection of the error, just a teeny bit of feeling, and then you're not supposed to stay in the feeling. This is what often comes.
Have you done that? Did it work?
Me, I tried your way actually. So, I thought I was trying, but I have heard many saying this, and like you said, we can only access quite not very advanced spirits. So
they're telling you their truth, and I'm telling you God's truth.
Yeah,
so
that's
so we
why
can
access the spirit you can access. We will more access spirit that are more mind driven. Yeah. So they will not say to us, "Yeah, that's the emotional way."
That's right. They're on the natural path. They're on the mind. They're trying to use their mind to progress. They've been doing that for centuries, many of them, and they have made some progress. None of them above the sixth sphere, but they have made some progress, and so they're very attached. The spirits are very attached to you just doing it their way. Yeah. And they think you do it that way, it's going to be good for you. But none of them have got a relationship with God. Yeah. Yep. So, and that should also be an interesting key But it's hard to tell because a lot of those spirits will say, I've got a relationship with God. And then when you ask them, well, define God, they say, well, I'm a part of God.
Yeah.
And then you go, oh, yeah, okay. Now I know.
Yeah. Just from this experiment of asking a question,
Yep.
in our condition, I mean, on this earth, we
Yeah.
have tendency to only get the information from this quite a bit better than us, but low spirit, as you qualify them, and that so it's a bit difficult to make the difference between a reasonable leading general stuff they tell us and what God would say. It's a bit difficult to make the difference because it seems reasonable in what they say. They
Yeah.
often give.
Well, it
quite a lot of
seems
advice.
reasonable to your mind,
Yeah.
doesn't it? But see, when I feel about it, it's not reasonable to my soul. It seems reasonable to your mind. And this is the trouble with your mind assessing, is that you will often be presented with information that seems reasonable, but it is incomplete and it does not include your soul, your emotional self. So there's many, many spirits who believe their soul is their spirit body. So they believe when you say the word soul, they're hearing spirit body. Right? So they don't know about the soul yet even. They don't even know what's in their own soul yet even. And they don't even know that the process they went through was actually a process in harmony with the law of compensation that they had to engage emotionally, but it took them hundreds of years to do it because they were so slow dealing with every emotion.
I agree.
Yeah.
Makes
And
sense.
so they don't understand these things, and so that's what they're going to share with you. So the problem with receiving information from spirits oftentimes is the information is very incomplete. You know, it's based on their personal experience rather than what is God's absolute truth. Yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe we can illustrate that, maybe. But how you are, maybe.
Yeah.
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 Because
Yes.
we have a spirit who would like to.
There's two spirits, actually.
There's two spirits.
Well, it's a whole. There's so many spirits, but anyway.
Yeah, we have some spirits who would like to talk to you about their experience. So, you up to doing it?
Yeah, but we don't have much time, and they've got a lot to say. So
Well, we'll see how we go, and
don't-
hopefully also we get the chance to answer some ask them some questions, right? So let's bring this over a bit so it's more central, so everybody can see.
sort of thought we'd run out of time. Okay. Oh, number. Yeah, I don't need that now.